The Dakota Territory, 1878. A winter that clawed with icy teeth. Elara Vance, a woman seeking solitude, found more than she bargained for when a blizzard swept through the sacred Paha Sapa, the Black Hills. A Lakota warrior, teetering on the precipice of death, collapsed at her doorstep. Compassion warred with fear, but she dragged him in. She had 3 days. 3 days before the snow gave up its secrets. 3 days before his people came their war cries, echoing in the frozen air, surrounding her tiny cabin, demanding answers. Or vengeance. The wind was a living entity, a screaming banshee clawing at the solitary cabin nestled deep within the folds of the Paha Sapa. Elara Vance, a woman whose resilience was etched into the lines around her clear blue eyes as surely as the landscape was carved by glaciers, pressed her lips into a thin line. Each gust that rattled the window panes and whistled down the stone chimney was a reminder of her isolation. An isolation she had once craved, but now in the teeth of the fiercest blizzard she'd witnessed in her 5 years here felt more like a tightening noose. Her cabin, built with her own hands and those of her late husband, Daniel, was small but sturdy. Hewn logs chinked tight with mud and moss formed a bulwark against the elements. Daniel had been gone 3 years now, taken by the lung fever that respected no strength of man. Since then the silence had been her closest companion, broken only by the rustle of pines, the chatter of a curious squirrel, or the distant howl of a wolf. She had come to this wilderness an outsider, a white woman, in a land that had belonged to the Sioux, the Lakota, for generations beyond counting. She'd learned to live alongside the ghosts of their presence, respecting the silent, unseen boundaries, never venturing too far, never taking more than she needed. The blizzard had raged for 2 days, a relentless white fury that had transformed the familiar contours of the land into an alien, undulating landscape. Elara had fuel and food enough, her larder stocked with dried meats, preserved berries and flour. Her concern lay not for herself, but for the creatures caught in the storm's unyielding grip. On the 3rd morning, the wind had lessened its howl to a mournful sigh, though snow still fell thick and heavy, muffling the world. Elara, wrapped in a thick wool shawl over her buckskin dress, peered through a small section of the window she'd scraped clear of frost. The world outside was a monochrome canvas of white and grey, the trees burdened sentinels draped in heavy ermine. It was then she saw it. A smudge of darkness against the pristine snow, near the edge of the clearing where the forest began to reclaim the land. At first she dismissed it as a fallen branch or a shadow, but as the light subtly shifted, the shape resolved itself with horrifying clarity. It was a man, or what was left of one. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Elara. Her immediate instinct was to bolt the door to pretend she hadn't seen. This was Lakota territory. Relations were fragile. The treaties were ink on paper often broken, and the memory of conflicts like the one at the Greasy Grass was still raw in the hearts of both peoples. A lone white woman, a dead or dying Indian warrior near her cabin. It was a recipe for disaster. But Daniel's voice, warm and steady, even in memory, echoed in her mind. Every soul's worth saving. Elara, if you've the means. He'd been a good man, a kind man, and she was his wife. Still, she pulled on her thickest mittens, wrapped a scarf tighter around her head, and took down Daniel's old hunting rifle from its pegs above the hearth, not for aggression but for protection against what she wasn't sure. The wolves had been bolder this winter. The snow was hip-deep in places, each step a lung-burning effort. The The cold bit at any exposed skin, raw and unforgiving. As she drew closer, the details became clearer. The man was Lakota, his heritage proclaimed by the remnants of his attire visible beneath the snow. Beaded leggings, a buffalo hide tunic now soaked and frozen. His dark hair, long and matted with ice, fanned out around a face that was ashen, almost blue. He lay sprawled on his stomach, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something, the other curled beneath him. A decorated bow lay splintered a few feet away, and a quiver of arrows was still strapped to his back, though several were missing. There was no horse in sight. Elara knelt, the rifle laid carefully beside her in the snow. She reached out a gloved hand, hesitated, then touched his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, thready and faint, a fragile butterfly wing fluttering against the icy grip of death. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. He was young, perhaps no more than 25 winters. A warrior in his prime, struck down. But by what? The storm, or something more sinister. There was no visible wound she could discern immediately, but the way he was curled suggested pain beyond just the cold. He was dying. If she left him, he would be dead before the sun reached its zenith, if it bothered to show its face at all that day. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. Bringing him into her cabin was an enormous risk. What if he woke violent? What if his people found him there with her? They might assume the worst. Yet to leave him to the snow felt like a betrayal of her own humanity. Damn it all! She muttered the words, snatched away by the wind. She couldn't do it. She couldn't leave him. With a grunt of exertion, Elara set about the Herculean task of moving him. He was heavy, all dead weight and frozen muscle. She tried to lift him, then to drag him. The snow fought her, sucking at his prone form. Finally, using her shawl as a makeshift sling under his shoulders, she began to pull inch by painstaking inch towards the cabin. Her breath rasped in her chest. Her muscles screamed, and the cold seeped into her bones. The 50 yards to her door felt like 50 miles. Each step was a prayer, a curse, a desperate plea to some unseen force to give her strength. Inside the relative warmth of the cabin was a shock. She managed to drag him onto the rag rug before the hearth collapsing beside him, gasping for air. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the room was chilling fast. Her first priority was to revive the flames. With trembling hands, she added kindling and then larger logs, coaxing the fire back to life. Only then did she turn her full attention to the Lakota warrior. As the fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, Elara began the delicate and dangerous task of tending to the unconscious Lakota. The heat in the small cabin began to build slowly, chasing the deadly chill from his limbs. But he remained terrifyingly still, his skin like frosted marble. She had to get him out of his frozen clothes. It was a violation, she knew. To touch an unknown man so intimately, a man from a people who were often portrayed as enemies, felt deeply unsettling. But his life depended on it. His tunic and leggings were stiff with ice, and she had to carefully cut some of the thongs with Daniel's hunting knife to remove them without causing further injury or tearing the hide which she sensed held value. Beneath the outer layers, his skin was shockingly cold. She worked quickly, her movements practical and devoid of any thought other than survival. His survival. She covered him with her thickest wool blankets, Daniel's old quilt, and her own spare one, piling them high. Then she heated water and, using soft rags, began to gently chafe his hands and feet trying to restore circulation. His face was lean with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, now slack in unconsciousness. A small faded scar ran along his left temple, partially hidden by his damp hair. It was as she was trying to ease his position to make him more comfortable that she found the source of his incapacitation beyond the cold. Tucked beneath him, pressed into his side, was the fletching of an arrow. The shaft had broken off, leaving the arrowhead and a few inches embedded deep in his right side, just below the ribs. The surrounding buckskin was stiff with frozen blood, a dark stain against the lighter hide. Elara's breath hitched. This changed everything. He hadn't just been caught in the storm. He'd been shot. Ambushed. By whom rival warriors? White men. The possibilities were all grim. Her knowledge of medicine was rudimentary, learned from her mother, and supplemented by necessity in the wilderness. She knew how to treat fevers, set simple fractures, and stitch wounds. But an arrow potentially barbed, lodged near vital organs, was beyond her experience. To leave it in invited infection and slow death. To remove it risked uncontrollable bleeding or further internal damage. He groaned, then a low, guttural sound, and his eyelids fluttered. Dark eyes, unfocused and clouded with pain, stared up at the ceiling, not seeing her. He muttered something in a language she didn't understand the words, rough and strained. Lakota. The sounds were alien, yet held a desperate urgency. Easy now, she whispered more to soothe herself than him. You're safe. For now. She knew she had to try to remove the arrowhead. She sterilized Daniel's sharpest knife blade in the flames, her heart hammering against her ribs. Taking a deep breath, she gently cut away the buckskin around the wound. The flesh was torn and swollen, an angry purple red. The broken shaft was buried deep. Gritting her teeth, she prayed for a steady hand. She probed gently, trying to ascertain the angle, the depth. He cried out a sharper, more coherent sound this time, and his body arched even in its weakened state. I'm sorry. She breathed, tears pricking her own eyes from the tension and the smoke of the fire. I have to. She would need him conscious, or at least more aware to know if the arrowhead was barbed. If it was pulling it straight out, would be catastrophic. He lapsed back into unconsciousness, or perhaps just a stupor of pain and cold. Elara sat back on her heels, feeling a wave of despair. What was she doing? She was a solitary woman, not a physician. For the rest of that first day and into the night, she focused on warming him, forcing sips of warm broth between his cracked lips when he showed the slightest sign of rousability. She cleaned the external part of the wound as best she could with boiled water and a poultice of yarrow, a plant she knew helped staunch bleeding and fight infection. The arrow remained. The second day dawned with no break in the snow, though the wind had died completely. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the warrior's labored breaths. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes his eyes would open, and a flicker of awareness would pass through them. He'd stare at her, not with hostility, but with a deep animalistic confusion, perhaps a touch of fear. She spoke to him softly, telling him he was safe, that she was trying to help, though she doubted he understood her words. She simply hoped the tone would convey her intent. She found a small leather pouch tied to his belt, which she had removed earlier. Hesitantly, she opened it. Inside were a few pieces of dried meat, a flint and steel, and a small, intricately carved bone wolf. A totem, perhaps, or a child's gift. It felt deeply personal, and she quickly closed the pouch, feeling like an intruder. She also noted the quality of his moccasins, the fine beadwork on his quiver. He was a man of some standing, or from a family that cared for him deeply. This only amplified her fears of the tribe's reaction when they inevitably came looking for him. Late in the afternoon of the second day, his fever began to climb. His skin, once so cold, now burned beneath her touch. He thrashed weakly, muttering deliriously in Lakota. Names, phrases, pleas. She could only guess at their meaning. She bathed his forehead with cool water, changed the poultice, and dribbled more broth and water into his mouth whenever possible. The arrow was a ticking clock. Infection was setting in. She had to make a decision. She could try to pull it or ride for help. But ride where the nearest settlement. Deadwood was a hard 2-day ride in good weather an impossibility now, and who there would help a Lakota warrior? More likely they'd finish the job. Fort Meade was even further. She was truly alone in this. That night, as she spooned a little deer broth between his lips, his eyes opened, and for the first time there was a spark of clear recognition. He focused on her face. His lips moved, forming a single word, a hoarse whisper. Thokaheya. Enemy Alara shook her head quickly. She put her hand gently on her own chest. Elara, she said, then pointed to him. Friend. Kola. She knew a few Lakota words gleaned from cautious, fleeting encounters with traders or from Daniel who'd had a passing interest. Kola. Friend. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Surprise. Disbelief. He tried to speak again, but a spasm of pain from his side contorted his features, and he coughed a dry, racking sound. The arrow, she said, pointing to his side. It must come out. Does it have barbs? She mimed barbs with her fingers. He seemed to understand. After a moment, his gaze hazy with fever, he gave a very slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Or so she hoped. It was so slight it could have been a tremor. But it was enough for her. Hope, fragile as it was, flared. The morning of the third day arrived with a chilling clarity. The snow had finally stopped. The sky was a hard, bright blue, and the sun, when it climbed above the snow-laden pines, cast long, stark shadows. The world outside was beautiful, pristine, and deadly silent. A silence that felt like a held breath. Elara knew this was her last chance. His fever was still high, but his breathing seemed a fraction easier. She had to act. She built up the fire, boiled more water, and laid out her cleanest rags and the knife. I am going to try and take it out now, she told him, speaking slowly and clearly, as if he might understand. He watched her, his dark eyes unnervatingly lucid despite the fever. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched. She knelt beside him, her stomach churning. Steady now, Elara. Daniel's voice again. She took a deep breath, offered a silent prayer, and grasped the slick, broken shaft of the arrow. The warrior's name, Elara would later learn, was Wanacha, meaning flower in the Lakota tongue. A name that seemed at odds with the fierce lines of his face, and the warrior's life etched into his very being. But in that moment, he was simply a man in agony. His life held precariously in her trembling hands. He watched her with an intensity that was almost unbearable. His dark eyes pools of fevered pain, and something else, a stoic resignation perhaps, or a flicker of desperate hope. He understood what she was about to do. He gave a single slow blink, as if in assent. "Hold still," she whispered, though he was already unnervingly immobile. "This will hurt." An understatement of monumental proportions. She positioned the knife blade alongside the arrow shaft, intending to gently widen the entry point, just enough to ease its passage if the head was indeed smooth, or to feel for barbs if her earlier interpretation of his gesture had been wrong. Her fingers, clumsy with a mixture of cold and trepidation, fumbled slightly. She drew a steadying breath. The warrior gritted his teeth, a low hiss escaping his lips as she began to apply pressure. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the chill that still clung to his deeper tissues. Elara focused all her senses narrowed to the task at hand, to the feel of the wood and flesh, the subtle resistances. The arrowhead was lodged against a rib. She could feel the hard bone. She had to angle it carefully downwards. Then, with a final desperate surge of will, she pulled. A raw cry ripped from deep within him, tore through the silence of the cabin. His back arched violently, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, digging into the furs beneath him. Elara, startled by the force of his reaction and the sudden release, stumbled back the broken arrow shaft, now tipped with a surprisingly small, smooth, dark stone arrowhead, clutched in her hand. Blood, dark and venous, welled instantly from the wound, much more than before. Panic seized her. She had done it, but at what cost? "The poultice," she gasped to herself, scrambling for the prepared bundle of yarrow and plantain leaves she'd made. She pressed it firmly against the bleeding wound, applying all the pressure she could muster. The warrior groaned, his body trembling, then went limp, his eyes rolling back slightly. He had fainted, or perhaps succumbed to the sheer shock of it all. For long moments, Elara knelt there, pressing down her own heart, thundering in her ears louder than the crackling fire. The blood continued to seep, staining the compress, her hands, the furs. Too much. Too much. A frantic voice screamed in her mind. Had she killed him? Had her attempt to save him only hastened his demise? Slowly, agonizingly, the bleeding began to subside. The yarrow was doing its work. His breathing, though shallow, was even. The color, however, remained deathly pale beneath his fevered flush. She added more wood to the fire, the sudden activity a small release for her jangled nerves. She then cleaned the wound again as best she could. Her touch surprisingly gentle despite the turmoil within her, and bound it tightly with strips of clean linen torn from one of her few good petticoats. She sat back exhausted, her body aching, her hands stained crimson. The warrior lay still, mercifully unconscious. The arrowhead, she noted with a distant part of her mind, was indeed unbarbed, finely crafted from obsidian or a similar dark stone. It was not the make of U.S. Army arrows, nor did it look like those of the crow or Pawnee she had seen depicted in illustrations. It was different. Another mystery, but one for later. If there was a later. Throughout that third day, Elara hovered between hope and despair. One archer's fever raged, and he drifted in a frightening limbo between delirium and a stillness that mimicked death too closely. She kept him hydrated with sips of water and weak willow bark tea, a natural fever reducer. She talked to him soft, meaningless words, simply to fill the oppressive silence, and perhaps offer some comfort to a spirit lost in shadowlands. As dusk began to bleed purple and grey into the western sky, casting long, eerie shadows from the snowdrifts. Outside, Elara was ladling watery rabbit stew into a bowl. Her own hunger, a dull ache she'd mostly ignored. The cabin was quiet. The only sounds the bubbling of the pot and Wanacha's faint respirations. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through the stillness, sharp and distinct. Not the wind, not a branch falling, the rhythmic crunch of snow underfoot. Many feet, or hoofbeats. Her blood ran cold. She froze ladle halfway to the bowl, her head cocked, straining her ears. It came again, closer this time. Unmistakably, hoofbeats muffled by the deep snow, but drawing nearer with a terrifying certainty. Not just one horse. Several. A lot. Dropping the ladle with a clatter, she rushed to the small frost-covered window, scraping a patch clear with her fingernail. Her heart leaped into her throat, pounding like a trapped bird. Emerging from the tree line where the shadows lay thickest were riders. At least a dozen, maybe more, their forms dark and imposing against the snow-covered landscape. They were Lakota, their attire unmistakable even at this distance. Buffalo robes, feathered adornments on some rifles cradled in their arms. They moved with a silent, predatory grace, fanning out their horses, picking their way carefully through the deep drifts. They weren't just passing by. They were heading directly for her cabin. They knew. They must have tracked him. How could they not? A warrior of his apparent importance wouldn't simply vanish. Terror, raw and primal, gripped Alara. This was what she had feared from the moment she'd dragged Wanacha inside. His tribe, his family, his fellow warriors. And he lay inside her cabin, wounded unconscious, his blood on her hands and floor. How would this look to them? They would see a white woman, an outsider, and their missing kinsman near death within her walls. She backed away from the window, her gaze darting around the small space. The rifle. Daniel's rifle was still propped near the door. But what good would one rifle be against so many? It would be suicide. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The hoofbeats grew louder, a thunderous drumbeat, signaling an impending reckoning. Then a sound that chilled her to the bone, a single high-pitched cry, a warrior's call, sharp and clear in the frozen air. It was answered by others. They were surrounding the cabin. Alara's mind raced. Should she try to signal them to show she meant no harm? But how? Her Lakota was pitifully inadequate for such a complex explanation. Could she even make herself heard above their numbers, above her own fear? Wanacha chose that moment to stir. A low moan escaped his lips, and his eyes fluttered open. They were still clouded with fever, but a flicker of awareness of alarm seemed to register as the cabin door suddenly rattled under a heavy blow. "Tamakoche, my land, country, people," he whispered, his voice raspy, trying to lift his head. Outside, a commanding voice shouted in Lakota words she couldn't understand, but whose tone was unmistakably demanding, angry. The wood of the doorframe groaned. Alara looked from the barely conscious warrior on her floor to the besieged door, then back to the rifle. Her hand instinctively went to the small, smooth arrowhead she had tucked into her apron pocket after removing it. Proof of her actions, but proof of what mercy or something they would interpret as an attack. The fragile peace of her isolated world had shattered. The storm outside had passed, but a far more dangerous one was now breaking directly upon her. 3 days. Her 3 days of mercy were over. Now it seemed came the judgment. The heavy thud against the door came again, stronger this time, making the sturdy timbers shudder. It was followed by a barrage of Lakota words, sharp, percussive, and undeniably hostile. Elara could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a palpable wave of aggression from the men outside. Wanacha, despite his weakness, struggled to push himself up on an elbow, his face contorted with pain and a dawning comprehension. Yate. Okichize. My people. Battle. They came for battle. War. He managed, his breath catching. His eyes, though still fever-bright, darted towards the door. Then to Elara, a complex emotion swirling within them. Concern perhaps mixed with the warrior's instinct. "Stay down," Elara urged, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "You're too weak." She had to make a choice, and quickly, barricade the door and pray they wouldn't burn her out. Unlikely to succeed. Try to reason with them. How with no common language for nuanced explanation? Her mind was a frantic whirl. Then a different sound, the scrape of a rifle butt against the door, followed by a momentary silence, as if the men outside were conferring or perhaps issuing an ultimatum. Taking a desperate breath, Elara made her decision. She would not cower. She had done what she thought was right. She would face them. "I'm going to open the door," she said, more to herself than to Wanacha. She laid Daniel's rifle on the table in plain sight, but out of her own reach, a gesture she hoped might be understood as non-threatening. She smoothed her apron, her hands shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists. "Washte. Washtela. Good. Be kind." Gentle Wanacha rasped, his gaze fixed on her, an appeal in his eyes. He understood the danger she was in. Elara nodded, though her heart felt like it would beat its way out of her chest. She moved to the door, her legs feeling like lead. With a deep, steadying breath, she lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door inward, squinting against the sudden glare of the late afternoon sun reflecting off the snow. The sight that greeted her stole what little breath remained in her lungs. A semicircle of at least 15 Lakota warriors faced her cabin, their horses stamping restlessly in the snow, breath pluming in the frigid air. They were armed with a mixture of rifles, bows, and lances, their faces grim, impassive, their dark eyes narrowed, fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. Some wore war bonnets of eagle feathers that cascaded down their backs, symbols of their prowess and spiritual power. Others had simpler adornments, feathers tied in their hair, faces painted with stark symbolic lines. They were formidable, an embodiment of the wild, untamed spirit of this land, and they looked upon her with undisguised suspicion and cold anger. At their forefront, mounted on a striking black war pony with a single white blaze, was a man who radiated authority. He was older than Wanacha, perhaps in his late 30s, his face deeply lined, bearing the look of one who had seen many harsh winters and many battles. A long, jagged scar ran from his temple down his cheek, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent, grim cast. His eyes, like chips of obsidian, missed nothing. This had to be their leader. Silence descended thick and heavy, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the distant caw of a crow. Elara stood framed in her doorway, small and terribly vulnerable before them. She could feel their collective gaze dissecting her, judging her. The leader spoke, his voice deep and resonant, carrying easily in the still air. The Lakota words were sharp, a clear demand. Elara could only shake her head slightly, her palms open in a gesture she hoped conveyed helplessness in understanding. I don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. One of the younger warriors, his face painted with yellow and black streaks, snarled something and nudged his horse forward, lifting his rifle menacingly. "Hechel. No, stop that," the leader barked without even looking at the younger man, who immediately halted, his expression sullen. The leader's gaze remained locked on Elara. He dismounted with a fluid grace, handing his reins to another warrior. He walked slowly towards her, his moccasins making almost no sound on the packed snow near the cabin entrance. He stopped a few feet away, his presence utterly commanding. He pointed towards the interior of the cabin, then made a questioning gesture, his eyes searching hers. He was asking about Wanacha. There was no doubt. Elara nodded slowly. "He is here," she said. Then, remembering the word Wanacha had used, she added Kola, friend. She tapped her chest. "Elara. Kola." The leader's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, surprise, contempt, crossed his eyes at her use of the Lakota word. He spoke again, slower this time, pointing to himself. "Mato," he said, then gestured again to the cabin. "Wanacha, Itemato." My younger brother. Wanacha's brother. The pieces clicked into place. This was family come to find their own. The intensity of their presence suddenly made even more sense. Mato took another step, peering past Elara into the dim interior. He saw the shape on the floor, bundled in blankets. His eyes narrowed further. He looked back at Elara, and this time his voice was harder, laced with a clear threat. He gestured with his chin, indicating she should step aside. Elara knew this was the critical moment. If they thought she had harmed him, she was dead. She held her ground, but raised her hands slowly, palms out. "He was hurt," she said, speaking clearly, hoping the sincerity in her tone would somehow bridge the language gap. "In the snow, dying." She pointed to her own side, mimicking the location of Wanacha's wound. "Arrow." Then, remembering the arrowhead in her pocket, she fumbled for it, her fingers clumsy. She held it out on her open palm. Small, dark, and undeniably an instrument of harm. Mato's eyes fixed on the arrowhead. He leaned closer, his gaze sharp and analytical. He recognized the craftsmanship. He grunted a low sound deep in his chest, and then looked at Elara with a new, complex expression. It wasn't friendly, not yet, but perhaps a fraction less hostile. He took the arrowhead from her palm, turning it over in his own calloused fingers. He barked an order over his shoulder. Two warriors dismounted and warily approached the cabin, their rifles ready. Elara stepped back, allowing them entry, her heart still pounding. She watched as they moved to Wanacha's side. One knelt, placing a hand on Wanacha's forehead, then his neck. He spoke to Wanacha in low, urgent Lakota. Wanacha's voice, though weak, answered. A short, halting exchange followed. Elara couldn't understand the words, but the tension in the cabin seemed to lessen by a tiny fraction. Wanacha was alive. He was speaking. He could tell them something. The warrior who had checked on Wanacha looked up at Mato, who was still standing just outside the doorway, and spoke, his tone reporting. Mato listened intently, his gaze shifting from the warrior inside to Elara and back to the arrowhead in his hand. He then did something unexpected. He stepped fully inside the cabin, his tall frame seeming to fill the small space. The two warriors made room for him. He knelt beside his brother, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as he looked at Wanacha's pale, fevered face. He spoke to him gently, his hand resting on Wanacha's shoulder. Wanacha responded, his words weak, but seemingly coherent. He even managed a slight gesture towards Elara. Mato listened, his face unreadable. The exchange was longer this time. Finally, Mato rose. He looked at Elara, a long, searching look that seemed to penetrate to her very soul. The cold hostility was still there, but it was now mingled with confusion, perhaps even a grudging acknowledgement. He spoke to her not in the harsh tones of before, but with a measured gravity. He pointed to the bloodstains on the floor, then to the discarded, bloodied rags, then to the bound wound on Wanacha's side, which his warriors had briefly exposed. Then he held up the arrowhead again. He tapped his own chest. Wanacha, Thokaheya el Uungi. Wanacha had an enemy there where he was. He then gestured vaguely towards the northeast. Mapia Lutanagi. Red Cloud's people/spirit, possibly meaning Oglala, or a specific band known to be in that direction, or even referring to a type of arrow, if Red Cloud was a maker's mark or style. However, given the context of an enemy, it's more likely referring to another group or faction. Elara's eyes widened. Red Cloud. She knew that name. A powerful Oglala Lakota chief. Was Mato implying Wanacha had been attacked by other Lakota? Or was it a misunderstanding of her limited grasp of the language? The Sikangu and Oglala were both Lakota generally allies, though internal disputes were not unheard of. Or perhaps Red Cloud's people was a broader term for hostiles in that direction. The arrowhead. It was distinct, not army, not crow. Mato recognized it. Wanacha had been attacked by someone Mato clearly considered an enemy, and she, Elara, had removed their arrow. Mato then pointed to Elara, then to Wanacha, and then made a gesture of pulling, mimicking her, removing the arrow. He grunted. Washte. Good. A wave of relief so profound it left her weak, washed over Elara. He understood at least partially. He knew she hadn't been the attacker. She had helped. However, the situation was far from resolved. The cabin was still surrounded. The warriors outside were still tense, their weapons ready. Mato's expression, while less overtly hostile towards her, remained stern and watchful. He had many more questions, and she had no easy way to answer them. He issued a series of commands to his men. 2 more entered the cabin, bringing with them a buffalo robe. They carefully and with surprising gentleness began to prepare Wanacha to be moved. It was clear they intended to take him. Elara watched, feeling a strange mixture of relief and a sudden, unexpected pang of loss. She had fought for this man's life for 3 days. Now he would be gone back to his own people. Mato turned back to her. He held out the small, dark arrowhead. He didn't offer it back to her, but looked at it, then at her, then spoke again, his tone a question, but also a statement. He pointed outside to the vast, snow-covered wilderness. Tokaheya. Ata. The enemy is still out there. The implication hung heavy in the air. The ones who had shot Wanacha were still at large, and perhaps they were not far. The fragile truce within her cabin felt like the calm eye of a storm, with dangers still swirling all around. Mato's words, Thokaheya, Ata, the enemy, is still out there, resonated in the small cabin, painting a stark picture of ongoing peril. He wasn't just stating a fact. It felt like a warning, perhaps even an unspoken question of where her loyalties would lie if those enemies reappeared. The warriors worked efficiently, their movements practiced and coordinated. They gently lifted Wanacha, wrapped snugly in the thick buffalo robe. His face still pale, but his eyes now open and aware, watching the proceedings with a quiet intensity. He caught Ilara's gaze and offered the slightest of nods, a silent acknowledgement that transcended the language barrier. It was a look of gratitude, perhaps, but also of concern for her. Ilara stepped back, giving them space, her mind reeling. She had saved him from the brink of death, and his people had come not in blind vengeance, as she had feared, but with a cautious, guarded assessment of the truth. Yet the danger was not over. If Wanacha's attackers were indeed still in the vicinity, her isolated cabin could become a flashpoint. Matto watched his men prepare a makeshift travois, using 2 long lodgepole pine saplings and another buffalo hide, a conveyance that could be dragged by one of the horses. He then turned his attention back to Ilara. His scrutiny was intense, as if he were trying to read the very thoughts in her head. He spoke again. His Lakota measured his gestures clear. He pointed to the tracks outside, his warriors' tracks. Wanacha's nearly obliterated trail leading to her cabin and the vast, untracked snow beyond. He then made a sweeping gesture indicating the surrounding forest, his expression grim. He was conveying that their enemy was skilled, perhaps having circled back, or that the heavy snow had hidden their trail. Suddenly from outside, a sharp cry from one of the warriors acting as a lookout. It was a warning. Matto's head snapped up. He barked a question. The reply came quickly, urgently. Every warrior tensed. The 2 inside with Wanacha paused, their hands instinctively going to the knives at their belts. Matto moved to the cabin door, peering out cautiously. Ilara, her heart once again hammering, crept towards the window, trying to see what had caused the alarm. In the distance at the edge of the clearing where the trees began to press in, figures were emerging. Not Lakota. These were white men, 4 of them dressed in rough, winter-worn buckskins and furs, carrying long rifles. They moved with a furtive hunting. Cautiousness, their eyes scanning the area. They hadn't seen the main body of Lakota warriors yet, who were mostly shielded by the cabin and the trees on the other side. They were focused on the cabin itself and the fresh tracks leading to it. Them. Ilara breathed a horrified recognition dawning. She'd seen 2 of these men before months ago passing through. Prospectors they'd claimed, but there was a hardness about them, a predatory gleam in their eyes that had unsettled her then. Scalp hunters, perhaps, or simply men who preyed on the vulnerable, red or white. They must have been the ones who ambushed Wanacha, perhaps for his horse, his weapons, or simply for the grim satisfaction of it. And now, seeing the smoke from her chimney and the fresh activity, they had returned, likely to finish the job, or to see what spoils could be had. Matto saw the recognition in her face. He looked from her to the approaching men, then back. A silent understanding passed between them. These were the Thokaheya. He issued a rapid series of guttural commands. The warriors outside melted back further into the trees, taking cover with their horses, their movements swift and silent. The 2 inside with Wanacha carefully lowered him back to the floor, propping him against the wall, where he would be somewhat protected. One warrior staying with him rifle ready. The other joined Matto near the door. The air crackled with a new, deadlier tension. This was no longer about misunderstanding or suspicion between Ilara and the Lakota. This was about a common enemy. Matto looked at Ilara. He pointed to Daniel's rifle on the table. Then he pointed at her. It was not a command, but a question, an acknowledgement of her presence, her cabin, her potential role. Ilara understood. He was giving her a choice. She could stay out of it, cower in a corner. Or she could defend her home, and by extension the man she had saved alongside these warriors, who just moments ago she had feared. Her decision was instantaneous. These men had brought violence to her doorstep once by attacking Wanacha. Now they threatened to do so again. This was her land, her home, and the man lying wounded on her floor was under her protection until he was safely with his own. She picked up the rifle. Her hands were surprisingly steady. She checked the load, an action Daniel had drilled into her. She wasn't a warrior, but she knew how to shoot. She had hunted for her own food for 3 years. Matto saw her resolve. A flicker of something akin to respect crossed his scarred face. He gave a curt nod. The 4 white men were closer now, advancing cautiously towards the cabin. One of them, a burly man with a matted red beard, called out, "Hello, the cabin. Anybody home?" His voice was rough-edged with a false friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. Elara moved to the window, positioning herself to the side, shielded by the log wall. Matto stood near the door, slightly ajar, his own rifle aimed. "We saw your smoke, just checking if you're all right in this snow," the red-bearded man called again a little louder. They were about 30 yards out, close enough for their expressions to be visible, greedy, watchful. Matto grunted a single Lakota word to Elara. She didn't understand it, but the intent was clear. "Wait." One of the other men, leaner and with shifty eyes, pointed to the tracks of the Lakota horses, partially visible around the side of the cabin. "Jed," he said, his voice lower. "Looks like company already here. Lots of it." The red-bearded man, Jed, scowled. "Indians." He spat into the snow. "What are they doing here?" He looked at the cabin more suspiciously. "Maybe they ain't friendly company." It was then that Wanacha, from his position on the floor, let out a sudden, surprisingly strong Lakota war cry. It was a cry of defiance, of warning to his enemies, and perhaps a signal to his own. All hell broke loose. Jed and his men, startled, immediately raised their rifles. "Ambush!" one of them yelled. Simultaneously, Matto threw open the door and fired. His shot was echoed by a volley from the concealed Lakota warriors. One of Jed's men screamed and clutched his shoulder, his rifle tumbling into the snow. Another yelped as a bullet tore through the fur of his cap. Elara sighted down the barrel of Daniel's rifle. She picked out the red-bearded leader, Jed, who was trying to take cover behind a snowdrift, firing wildly towards the cabin. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Jed cried out and stumbled, grabbing his thigh, though he didn't go down. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. The ambushers, caught completely by surprise and outnumbered, had no chance. 2 were hit in the first volley from the hidden warriors. Jed, wounded by Elara, tried to make a stand, but was quickly overwhelmed as 2 Lakota warriors, agile as mountain cats, burst from the trees and charged him, war clubs raised. The 4th man, the shifty-eyed one, turned to flee, but was brought down by a well-aimed shot from one of Matto's men. Within minutes, it was over. Silence, more shocking than the gunfire, descended again, broken only by the groans of the wounded attackers and the victorious shouts of the Lakota. Matto strode out, his rifle still smoking. His warriors emerged from their cover, securing the area, disarming the fallen men. There was a grim efficiency to their movements. They had faced death and delivered it with a warrior's stark pragmatism. Elara lowered her rifle, her body trembling from the adrenaline. She had shot a man, wounded him at least. There was no triumph in it, only a grim sickness. But there was also a fierce, undeniable sense of having protected what was hers, of having stood against a threat. Matto approached her. He looked at her, then at the spot where Jed had gone down, now surrounded by Lakota. He then looked at Daniel's rifle in her hands. He didn't smile. His face seemed incapable of it. but the hardness in his eyes had lessened, replaced by something that looked like raw, unadorned respect. He spoke, and this time his words were not just for her, but for his warriors, some of whom were now looking at her with a new curiosity, even awe. Washichuwingiang, Thawachayen Gitanka. White woman, her spirit will is strong, great. He then tapped his chest again. Lila Pilamayaye. Thank you very much. Wanacha, propped against the wall, managed a weak but genuine smile. He had seen it all. The immediate threat was neutralized. The Lakota had their wounded brother, and they had dispatched his enemies. Elara Vance, the solitary white woman of the Paha Sapa, was no longer just an outsider. She had, in a crucible of snow blood and gunfire, forged an unlikely, unspoken alliance. Matto gave orders. 2 of his men tended to Jed and the other wounded attacker, not with gentleness, but not with immediate execution either. Their fate would be decided later by Lakota justice. The dead were left where they fell for the snow and scavengers to claim. The warriors quickly prepared to depart. They gently lifted Wanacha onto the travois. He looked stronger now, his eyes clearer, as if the fight itself had infused him with a renewed will to live. Before they pulled away, Matto approached Elara one last time. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something which he pressed into her hand. It was a small, beautifully beaded leather pouch, clearly of some value. Wufila, a gift of thanks, gratitude, he said, for Wanacha, for them. This. He gestured to the scene of the brief, violent battle then to her. Elara looked at the pouch, then at him. You would have done the same for your kin, she said softly, not knowing if he understood the words, but hoping he understood the sentiment. Matto held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, a single profound acknowledgement. He turned, mounted his war pony, and with a final glance at the cabin, he gave the signal. The Lakota warriors with Wanacha secure on the travois melted back into the forest, disappearing as silently and suddenly as they had arrived, leaving Elara standing alone in the blood-stained snow before her small, silent cabin. The silence that returned was different now. It was no longer the silence of isolation, but the silence of aftermath, of reflection. Elara Vance looked down at the beaded pouch in her hand, then out at the vast, indifferent wilderness of the Paha Sapa. She had found a dying Lakota warrior in the snow. 3 days later, his tribe had surrounded her cabin, and in the heart of that terrifying confrontation, something wholly unexpected had been born. Not just survival, but a bridge, however fragile, between 2 worlds. The snows would melt, but the memory of these days, and the warrior named Wanacha, and his grim, honorable brother Matto, would remain etched in her soul as surely as the scar on Matto's face. Her solitude in the Black Hills would never quite feel the same again. Elara Vance's courage and compassion in the face of unimaginable fear rewrote her story in the unforgiving landscape of the Wild West. She chose humanity over prejudice, and in doing so forged an unexpected bond in a world defined by conflict. The Lakota warriors left her with more than just a gift. They left her with a testament to the strength of the human spirit, and the surprising paths to understanding that can be found even in the deepest snows of mistrust. What did you think of Elara's incredible story of bravery and unexpected alliance? Let us know in the comments below. If you were moved by her tale and want to see more historical dramas that explore the raw, untamed heart of the past, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching.